At 12:47 in the morning, two black SUVs blew through a red light on Meridian Avenue and screeched to a dead stop outside the emergency entrance of Hargrove Memorial Medical Center. Before the vehicles had fully stopped moving, the doors were already opening. 6 men stepped out wearing tactical vests and carrying weapons that had no business being in a hospital parking lot. They moved like people who had done this before. Not rushed, not panicked, just fast and deliberate in the specific way that made civilians instinctively step aside. The charge nurse at the intake desk had barely looked up before the lead operator reached the counter, placed both hands flat on the surface, and said 4 words. "We're here for Carter." Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that follow button right now and stay with me until the very end of this story, because what happens next is going to blow your mind. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. All right, let's go back to the beginning. 17 hours earlier, the day shift at Hargrove Memorial had started like every other one. The trauma bay smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. The overhead lights buzzed faintly in the way that everyone who worked there had long since stopped noticing, the same way they'd stopped noticing the scuff marks on the floor or the permanent dent in the supply cart nearest the door. Hargrove Memorial was not a glamorous hospital. It sat on the western edge of Caldwell, a mid-sized city in the flatlands where the winters came early and the city budget never quite stretched far enough. The ER ran lean, always had, which meant the staff who stayed did so because they actually wanted to be there, not because it was comfortable. Nurse Rachel Voss was 20 minutes into her shift when she found the morning med cart in the wrong bay again. She stood there a moment, jaw tight, then pushed it back to where it was supposed to be without saying a word about it to anyone. That was Rachel's way. Quiet correction, no announcement. She was 34 and she didn't look particularly remarkable standing there in dark blue scrubs with her hair pulled back in a low ponytail, medium height, the kind of face that didn't leave an immediate impression, which was something she had spent years cultivating, though nobody at Hargrove Memorial would have guessed that. To the staff, she was just reliable. The nurse who showed up early and left late. The one who could draw blood from a collapsed vein without making the patient flinch. The one who, for reasons nobody had ever thought to question, always seemed to know exactly what a trauma patient needed before the attending had finished their assessment. Charge nurse duties weren't officially hers. But on the mornings when the charge nurse called in sick, Rachel ran the floor like she'd been doing it her entire career, and nobody argued with the results. She didn't talk about her past. In 4 years at Hargrove Memorial, she'd deflected every personal question with such natural ease that her coworkers had eventually stopped asking. The general assumption was that she'd come from a bigger hospital somewhere, burned out, and landed here. Some people thought there might have been a difficult divorce. Others assumed she'd simply had enough of wherever she came from. None of them were right. The morning started falling apart a little before 9. The call came in from EMS while Rachel was in the middle of reconfiguring a medication dosage for a 17-year-old in Bay 3 whose attending had written the order wrong. She caught the error without drama, had it corrected in 2 minutes, and was walking back to the nurse's station when the radio crackled. Multiple vehicle collision on Route 9, 7 confirmed injured, 2 critical. ETA 14 minutes. The floor shifted into a different gear the way it always did when mass casualty protocol activated. Not chaos exactly, but a specific kind of controlled urgency that separated the experienced staff from the newer ones. Rachel was already moving toward the supply station when the PA overhead crackled with a secondary announcement. Dr. Harlan Westbrook to Trauma 1. Dr. Westbrook to Trauma 1. The name landed differently on Rachel than it did on most of the staff. She'd been aware of Harlan Westbrook since her 3rd week at Hargrove Memorial, when she'd watched him dress down a second-year resident in the middle of a patient corridor loud enough that visitors in the waiting room could hear it. He was the head of trauma surgery, 51 years old, with the particular confidence of someone who had received more praise than scrutiny throughout his entire career. His outcomes were good enough that the administration protected him. His personality was bad enough that nearly everyone else dreaded working with him. He walked into Trauma 1 like he owned the building, which in most practical senses he did. "Where are we?" he said, not to anyone specifically. Rachel answered because she was closest and because she had the information. 2 critical inbounds. EMS is reporting a 38-year-old male with chest trauma and possible internal bleeding, and a 52-year-old female with head injury and unstable vitals. Both conscious on scene, both deteriorating. Westbrook looked at her the way he sometimes did. A brief, flat assessment, like he was deciding how much weight to give whatever she'd said. "Get me Dr. Faulkner on the phone," he said to the room, and then walked past Rachel without acknowledging that she had spoken. She went back to preparing the bay. The ambulances arrived in a staggered 3-minute window. The first patient, the male with chest trauma, was already showing signs of tension pneumothorax when the paramedics rolled him in. Rachel could see it in the uneven rise of his chest before they'd finished their handoff report. She said so, calmly, without raising her voice because there was no reason to. Westbrook looked at the patient, looked at the monitor, and then looked at Rachel with an expression that came very close to contempt. "I'll make the assessment, thank you." "Yes, doctor." She stepped back. He ordered a chest X-ray. The imaging would take 6 minutes minimum to set up and process. Rachel stood at her position, watching the patient's oxygen saturation tick downward on the monitor, while everyone in the room waited for Westbrook to be ready to believe what she had already seen with her eyes. At 4 minutes, the set dropped to 88%. Westbrook ordered the needle decompression. Rachel had the equipment ready before he finished the sentence. She didn't say anything about that either. The second critical patient, the woman with the head injury, was more stable, though the word was relative. She had a GCS of 12, which meant she was conscious but not tracking well, and her blood pressure was doing something inconsistent that Rachel didn't like. She flagged it twice in the chart notes and mentioned it once, briefly, to the resident assigned to the case. The resident passed it along. Westbrook, who was still dealing with the first patient, waved it off. By 11:30, both critical patients were in surgery, and the floor had settled into the particular exhaustion that always followed a mass casualty response. Staff sat in corners, eating whatever was available, not really talking. The kind of tired that didn't respond to coffee. Rachel refilled her water bottle and went back to work. She had 4 patients still assigned to her from the morning rotation, and she went through them methodically. Vitals, medications, notes, the small human exchanges that most of the staff treated as optional, but she never did. The elderly man in Bay 7 who was frightened and trying not to show it. The college-aged woman in Bay 9 who had been waiting too long and was getting frustrated. Rachel gave each of them a few minutes of actual attention, not the performed kind. Listened. Answered questions without condescension. She was updating the chart on her 5th patient when the sound of raised voices reached her from the direction of the supply corridor. Not unusual. Hargrove Memorial had its share of interpersonal friction. Rachel continued charting. Then she heard her name. "Voss, where is she?" "But someone find Voss." She was already moving. The commotion was near the rear entrance to the trauma wing, a cluster of staff and 2 security personnel around a man in civilian clothes who was bleeding from a laceration on his forearm and speaking rapidly in a way that suggested shock more than panic. Beside him, barely upright, was a second man. Rachel saw the second man and went completely still for just under 2 seconds. Then she was moving again, faster. The second man was approximately 30 years old, lean and hard-muscled in the specific way that came from years of functional physical conditioning rather than any gym. He was wearing civilian clothes, cargo pants, a gray shirt, but neither item fit him quite right, the way clothes never quite fit people who usually wore something else. His left arm was braced against his ribs. His breathing was shallow and controlled, the deliberate breathing of someone managing pain rather than panicking from it, which told Rachel more than his visible injuries did. The laceration on his outer left thigh was deep. The way he was holding his arm suggested cracked or separated ribs at minimum, but it was his eyes that concerned her most. Glassy in one specific way she recognized, the way a person's eyes looked when their blood pressure had dropped enough to begin affecting their brain. "Get me a wheelchair," Rachel said to the nearest aide without breaking stride. Dr. Westbrook said, "Get me the wheelchair," she repeated. Same tone, not louder, just clearer. The wheelchair appeared. She had the second man seated and was checking his pulse at the wrist, fast, thready, before the aide had fully processed the exchange. "What happened?" she asked the first man, the one with the forearm laceration. He was shaking. Car came out of nowhere. "Marcus? He got thrown. He landed wrong. He was fine. He kept saying he was fine the whole drive here, but then he's not fine," Rachel said, not unkindly. When did he lose consciousness? In the car, maybe 2 minutes before we got here. Rachel looked at the man in the wheelchair, Marcus, who was not currently unconscious but was close. His eyelids were doing the thing. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, counted, and did not like what she found. "I need trauma too," she said to the charge nurse behind the desk, "and I need Westbrook or whoever is available." "Trauma 2 is being cleaned," the charge nurse said. Then trauma 3. She was already rolling the wheelchair. "Rachel," the charge nurse's voice had a different quality to it now. "Westbrook said no unauthorized admissions until he clears the board." Rachel stopped rolling. She turned around slowly. "This patient is going to be in cardiac arrest in the next 15 minutes if someone doesn't look at him," she said. "The board can be cleared in 15 minutes. "He was very specific. "Page him," Rachel said. "Tell him I said 15 minutes. He can argue with me after." She pushed the wheelchair through the trauma bay doors. Dr. Westbrook appeared 4 minutes later. He took one look at the situation. Rachel positioned at the bedside, a patient on monitors, an IV she'd placed already running fluids, and his face did something that went beyond displeasure. "Who authorized this?" "I did," Rachel said. "He presented in pre-shock. His pressure is 84/50. He has at least one internal bleed and possibly a pneumohemothorax based on breath sounds." "You diagnosed a pneumohemothorax." "I said possibly." "The ultrasound will tell you for certain, but I'd recommend doing it quickly." Westbrook's jaw was a hard line. He looked at her for a long moment, then at the patient, then at the monitor, then back at her. "Step out," he said. "Doctor?" "I said step out of this bay, Voss." There were 4 other people in the room. None of them moved or spoke. Rachel looked at Marcus on the gurney. The controlled, careful breathing, the pale skin, the blood pressure number blinking on the screen. "I'll be right outside," she said, and she said it to the patient, not to Westbrook. She stepped out. In the corridor, she stood with her back against the wall, arms at her sides. Not folded, not tense, just still. One of the newer nurses, a young woman named Priya, who had started 6 weeks ago and still looked slightly overwhelmed by most things, edged up beside her. "Are you okay?" Priya asked, low enough that it wouldn't carry. "Yes." "He does this all the time. Some of the other nurses say he's always been like this." "I know," Rachel said. "Is the patient going to be okay?" Rachel watched through the narrow window in the bay door. She could see the monitor. The blood pressure had dropped to 79. "Not if he doesn't move faster," she said quietly. Inside, Westbrook was doing the ultrasound. Rachel watched him find what she'd already told him he'd find. She watched his expression shift in the way a surgeon's expression always shifted when the evidence stopped leaving room for argument. He moved faster. 30 minutes later, Marcus was in surgery. The first man, the one with the forearm laceration, whose name turned out to be Derek, was sitting in a chair in the waiting area with a bandage on his arm, staring at nothing. Rachel found him there while she was passing through on her way to restock a supply cart. She stopped. "They got him into surgery," she said. "The surgeon who's working on him is good. He'll be okay." Derek looked up. He had dark circles under his eyes and a 2-day beard and the general appearance of someone for whom this day had been one thing after another. "You the one who pushed the wheelchair?" he asked. "Yes." "I saw you through the window. The doctor was yelling at you." He wasn't yelling. Derek gave her a look that suggested he had a different definition of the word. "Marcus is my brother," he said. He never asks for help. He drove himself to the ER last year with a broken collarbone. I don't even know how he let me bring him here tonight." "He didn't have much choice by the time he got here," Rachel said. "No." Derek was quiet a moment. "Thank you for, pushing." Rachel nodded once, picked up her supply cart, and went back to work. The afternoon passed. The trouble started at 4:15, when Westbrook came out of his post-surgery debrief and went looking for whoever had admitted Marcus without authorization. He found the paperwork. He found Rachel's name on it. He walked to the nurse's station where she was sitting and stood there until she looked up. "My office," he said. "When you're done with that chart." "I'll be 10 minutes," she said. It was 8 minutes. She finished the chart correctly and completely before she went. Westbrook's office was the corner room on the second floor, which meant it had 2 windows, which was not a distinction that had been earned so much as accumulated through tenure. He was behind his desk when she arrived. He did not tell her to sit down, and she did not sit down. "You admitted a patient without attending authorization," he said. "I stabilized a patient who was in pre-shock and paged the attending immediately." "That is not how this hospital operates, Voss." "No," she agreed. "It's how I operate when a patient is about to die." Westbrook looked at her with an expression that sat somewhere between contempt and a kind of grudging professional assessment. The contempt was winning. "You've been here 4 years," he said, "and in 4 years you have consistently overstepped your authority, second-guessed attending decisions, and made it very clear that you consider your own judgment superior to that of the physicians on this staff." Rachel said nothing. "I'm filing a formal complaint with administration. I'm recommending a disciplinary review, and effective tomorrow morning, I want you reassigned to the 3rd floor, out of my trauma department." There it was. Rachel stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "Is that all? Do you have something to say?" "No," she said. "I think you've said it." She left the office. In the stairwell on the way back to the 1st floor, she stopped on the landing and stood there for a moment with one hand on the railing. Not because she was upset, or not only because of that, because she was thinking. In a different life, she had stood in situations that were considerably worse than this and made decisions with considerably higher stakes than a disciplinary review. She had done it in places where the consequences of the wrong call weren't a formal complaint filed by a hospital administrator. She had done it with people shooting at her. This was not that. But it was the same principle. You see a problem, you fix it. You pay whatever it costs afterward. You don't fix it halfway because you're worried about the cost. She let out a slow breath and went back to work. The next 4 hours were unremarkable by the standards of a trauma ER, which meant they were still 3 separate minor emergencies, 2 medication questions she caught before they became problems, and one moment where a patient's family member began crying in the hallway, and she sat with them for 6 minutes before anyone else noticed they were there. At 8:43 p.m., her replacement arrived, and she gave handoff. She was in the locker room changing out of her scrubs when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, measured, with the specific flatness of someone trained to deliver information without inflection. "Is this Rachel Voss?" "Yes." "Ms. Voss, this is Major Denton Ferris with the United States Army Medical Command. I'm calling regarding a patient currently in surgery at your facility, a Sergeant Marcus Thales." Rachel went completely still. "Ms. Voss?" "I'm here," she said. "We became aware of the situation approximately 2 hours ago. We're sending personnel to Hargrove Memorial tonight. They'll arrive around midnight." A pause. "We were given your name as the admitting nurse. I was told you were the one who pushed for immediate intervention." "The patient was going to arrest," she said. "I understand. I also understand there was some resistance from the attending." "That's internal hospital business." Another pause, longer this time. "Ms. Voss," Ferris said, "before I end this call, I need to ask you something directly. The patient, Sergeant Thales, is part of a unit that doesn't appear in standard military directories. If any personnel arrive at your facility tonight presenting credentials, you'll know they're legitimate because they'll use the word Meridian. I'm telling you this because you may be the only staff member on shift who needs to know how to respond to their arrival." Rachel sat down on the bench in the locker room. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because Sergeant Thales' unit commander made a specific request," Ferris said. "He asked us to contact the nurse who saved his man's life. He said to tell her—" a brief hesitation. "He said to tell her that the old codes still mean something." The line went quiet. Rachel lowered the phone from her ear and stared at the opposite wall of the locker room for a long moment. The old codes. She hadn't heard that phrase in 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She put the phone back in her bag, finished changing, and sat in the locker room longer than she needed to. Not because she was afraid, not because she was hesitating, because something she had very carefully buried had just moved. Outside in surgery on the third floor, Marcus Thales taught Sergeant Marcus Thales, which was not the full extent of his designation, but was the version he used in civilian spaces, was alive and would remain so because a nurse no one at Hargrove Memorial really knew had refused to leave him in a hallway. And at 12:47 in the morning, exactly as Major Denton Ferris had said, two black SUVs blew through a red light on Meridian Avenue and stopped outside the emergency entrance. 6 men got out. They moved like people who had done this before. The lead operator reached the intake desk, placed both hands flat on the surface, and looked at the charge nurse on duty. Not Rachel, who was gone, who was supposed to be gone, who had left the building 40 minutes earlier and was currently sitting in her car in the parking structure 1 block away because she had not been able to make herself drive home. "We're here for Carter," the operator said. The charge nurse blinked. "I'm sorry." "Rachel Carter Voss," he said. "We were told she'd be here." In the parking structure 1 block away, Rachel's phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen. 1 word, no name, no number she recognized. Meridian. She stared at the word for 3 seconds. Then she got out of the car. She didn't run. Running attracted attention, and attention was the last thing she wanted in a parking structure at 1 in the morning. She walked, quick, purposeful, the kind of stride that said, "I belong here," without saying anything at all, down the concrete ramp and out onto Meridian Avenue, and the cold air hit her face and she kept walking. The SUVs were still outside the entrance. One of the operators was standing at the rear vehicle with his arms crossed and his back to the building, scanning the street. Not looking for threats, looking for her. She could tell the difference. He saw her when she was still half a block away. He didn't wave or call out. He just turned slightly and said something to the man beside him. And that man went back inside, and the first one waited. Rachel reached the entrance and stopped in front of him. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, compact, with close-cropped hair, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned to conserve energy over long stretches of doing nothing, followed by very sudden bursts of doing everything. He looked at her the way people looked at someone they'd been told about but hadn't met. "Ms. Voss," he said. "You had the wrong name at the desk," she said. "We had the right name. Carter Voss. You go by Voss here." A slight pause. "We weren't sure how much you'd kept." Rachel looked at him for a moment. "How is he?" "Still in surgery. Your people here say another hour, maybe 90 minutes. He'll make it." "We know." The operator's voice didn't change, but something around his eyes did, briefly. "We knew when we heard what you did in the bay." Rachel looked past him toward the entrance. Through the glass doors, she could see the charge nurse at the desk, craning her neck, pretending not to watch. "You should come inside," Rachel said. "Standing out here doesn't help anyone. We'd rather wait until we know who's going to give us trouble. The attending who's going to give you trouble is Harlan Westbrook, and he went home at 7. The night attending is Dr. Pauline Okafor. She'll work with you." Rachel paused. "I know her." The operator studied her for another moment. Then he said, "Price." "What?" "My name. Garrett Price." He didn't offer a hand. "Sergeant Thales is our medic, has been for 6 years." Something in that landed differently than he probably intended it to. Rachel had known plenty of unit medics. They were a specific kind of person. Not better than other soldiers. Not worse. Just shaped by a particular combination of things that most people didn't have to be shaped by. You learned to keep people alive in places and conditions where keeping people alive was supposed to be impossible, and you did it with whatever you had, and then you kept moving. "I know," she said, and she meant it in more than one way. Price looked at her steadily. "Major Ferris told you the commander's message." "He did." "Do you know what it means?" "Yes," Rachel said. "I do." He nodded once, slowly, like something had been confirmed that he'd already suspected but needed to hear said out loud. They went inside. The next 40 minutes were administrative in the worst possible sense. Not the dramatic kind of conflict, but the grinding, procedural kind, which was, in some ways, harder to navigate. Price and 2 of his people needed access to a surgical patient whose admission paperwork listed him under a partially altered name in a hospital where the night supervisor had standing instructions from Westbrook's office about unauthorized access to trauma patients, and where the charge nurse on duty, A heavy-set man named Gary, who Rachel had always found professionally adequate and personally exhausting, was treating the situation like a potential lawsuit rather than a medical reality. Rachel handled it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten anyone. She stood at the nurse's station and explained, clearly and without repetition, why the men in tactical vests needed to be allowed a waiting area with direct sightline to the surgical floor elevator, and why that was going to happen regardless of what Gary's standing instructions said, because the patient in question had a federal medical hold that superseded hospital administrative policy, and if Gary wanted to confirm that with someone above her pay grade, she could give him 3 numbers to call, and she'd wait. Gary stared at her. "You're not even supposed to be here," he said. "Your shift ended." "I know," Rachel said. "The numbers." Gary called one of the numbers. He was on the phone for 4 minutes. When he hung up, his expression had changed from obstructive to carefully neutral, which was the closest thing to cooperation Rachel was going to get from him at 1 in the morning. "Waiting area B," he said. "Down the hall." "Thank you, Gary." She walked Price and his people to waiting area B, which was a small room with chairs that were slightly less uncomfortable than the main waiting area, and a coffee machine that worked about 60% of the time. 2 of the operators sat. Price remained standing. The other 3 had dispersed to positions Rachel didn't entirely track, which she understood was intentional. "You should go home," Price said when the others were settled. "Probably," Rachel agreed and sat down. Price looked at her for a moment, then sat down across from her, which she took as him deciding not to argue about it. The room was quiet. Somewhere down the hall an elevator opened and closed. "How long were you in?" Price asked. 8 years. "What unit?" She told him. She watched his face when she said it, and his face did the thing that faces did when people heard that specific designation, a kind of recalibration, like a number being revised upward. "That's not a nursing MOS," he said. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. "You left voluntarily?" "Yes." Price looked at the middle distance between them, working through something. "Ferris said you've been here 4 years. Same hospital." "Yes." "You like it here?" It was an odd question. Rachel considered it honestly. "I like the work," she said. "The hospital is complicated." "Westbrook?" "Among other things." Price nodded slowly. He was the kind of person who asked questions in order to understand the full picture rather than to fill silence, which Rachel appreciated. Most people who asked questions in waiting rooms were filling silence. "The commander is going to want to speak with you," he said, "when Sergeant Thallis is stable." "I know." "He's not—" Price stopped, chose different words. "He's not the easiest person to talk to. He doesn't do gratitude the way most people do." "I wasn't looking for gratitude." "I know," Price said. "That's why he wants to talk to you." The coffee machine in the corner made a sound like it was considering breaking, then decided not to. Rachel looked at it. Price looked at it. Neither of them got up. At 2:14 a.m., a surgical resident named Dr. Kwame Asante came to waiting area B and told them that Marcus Thallis was out of surgery and in recovery and would be moved to a monitored room within the hour. He delivered this information with the careful neutrality of someone who had been briefed on the situation and decided the least complicated thing he could do was relay facts and leave. Price stood up. "He conscious?" "He's sedated. He'll be more coherent by morning." "We need someone with him tonight." Asante looked at Rachel in a way that asked, "Is this going to be my problem?" without saying so. "I'll speak with Dr. Okafor," Rachel said. "One of them can sit with him. Non-medical presence, observation only." Asante nodded quickly and left, relieved. It took another hour to arrange, and arranging it meant navigating Dr. Okafor, who was, as Rachel had said, reasonable, but was also working a night shift with 2 other difficult cases and had limited patience for anything that added complexity to her evening. She agreed to allow one of Price's people to sit outside the room, not inside. Rachel negotiated it to inside the room, beside the door, after pointing out that outside the door created a hallway obstruction that would violate fire code. Okafor looked at her. "You're not on shift, Rachel." "I know." "You're also, if I understand the paperwork correctly, facing a disciplinary review from Westbrook." "That's accurate." And you're here at 2:30 in the morning negotiating access for federal personnel. Yes. Okafor rubbed her eyes, which was as close as she got to showing fatigue on a night shift. Fine. Inside the room. Beside the door. If he so much as reaches toward a monitor, I'm calling security. Understood. Thank you, Pauline. Okafor walked away, shaking her head very slightly. Rachel got Price's designated operator, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who introduced himself only as Reeves, settled in the chair beside the door of Marcus Thales' recovery room, and then she stood in the hallway outside for a moment, and the hospital was quiet around her the way hospitals got quiet at 3 a.m., which was not actually silence, but a different register of noise, the low beeping of monitors, the distant sound of a cart, the ventilation system doing what ventilation systems did. She should go home. She knew she should go home. She went to the nurse's station instead and asked the night nurse if she could sit with the chart for a few minutes. And the night nurse, who recognized her and was too tired to question the request, said yes. Rachel sat with Marcus Thales' chart and read through everything from surgery. The repair had been more extensive than the initial assessment suggested. 2 separate bleeds, one of them deeper than the ultrasound had caught. The surgical team had done good work. He was young and strong, and had been in excellent physical condition before the accident, which mattered more than most people understood. The body had reserves that it would spend in emergencies, and his had spent them and come back. She closed the chart and sat there for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. In a different life, the one she'd had before Caldwell, before Hargrove Memorial, before 4 years of quietly rebuilding something that looked like a normal existence, she'd sat with a lot of charts like that. In field conditions where charts were sometimes just handwritten on whatever was available. In operating theaters that were not theaters in any recognizable sense of the word. She had made decisions in those conditions that she still turned over in her mind sometimes, not because she regretted them, but because decisions made under that kind of pressure left marks that didn't fully fade. She had left the service for reasons she hadn't explained to anyone at Hargrove Memorial, and didn't plan to. The reasons were complicated, and some of them were not hers to share. She had come to Caldwell because it was far enough from everywhere she'd been, and she had taken the job at Hargrove Memorial because she needed to keep doing the thing she was good at, which was keeping people alive. That was it. That was the whole answer, or the version of it she was comfortable with. She went to check on Marcus Thales at 4 a.m. because she was there and no one was going to stop her. Reeves looked up when she came in. He didn't reach for anything, just watched her the way he'd been trained to watch anyone entering a room, and then his posture shifted almost imperceptibly when he recognized her. "How is he?" she asked quietly. "Vitals have been steady for the last 40 minutes. She checked the monitor. He was right. She looked at the man in the bed, the controlled, careful face of someone who, even unconscious, looked like they were managing something. There was a scar along his jaw that hadn't been visible in the trauma bay, older, well-healed. His hands, resting outside the blanket, had the specific topography of hands that had done a great deal of particular kinds of work. "He's going to be angry when he wakes up," she said. Reeves made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Yeah, he hates being down." "They always do." She adjusted the blanket slightly. A small thing, unnecessary medically, but she did it anyway, and turned to leave. "Ms. Voss?" Reeves said. She stopped. "Price told me what you did in the trauma bay, with Westbrook." He paused, like he was deciding how much of what he wanted to say was worth saying. "He also told me about the review, that they're trying to move you out of trauma." Rachel waited. He stopped again. "I don't know what you were, before, but whatever it was, you don't deserve that." Rachel looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, and left before it could turn into something else. The morning shift change happened at 7, and with it came a different energy. The daytime hospital, louder, faster, fuller. Rachel had gone home for 3 hours and come back, which she recognized was not a healthy pattern, but was also not something she was capable of examining clearly when there was still something unresolved in the building. She was in the break room with a cup of actual coffee, not the machine in waiting area B, which she had tested and confirmed was today in the 40% not working category. When the door opened and Priya came in looking like she'd seen something she wasn't sure how to process. "There are a lot of people in the lobby," Priya said. "What kind of people?" "The kind from last night, except more of them. And there's a man in the lobby with, like..." She made a gesture that tried and failed to describe whatever she'd seen. "Insignia. A lot of insignia." Rachel set down her coffee. "Okay," she said. "Okay, as in you know what that means?" "Okay, as in I need you to do something for me," Rachel said. "Can you find Dr. Okafor before she leaves and tell her she should stay? Tell her there may be a situation that needs senior medical presence." "A situation? Please, Priya." Priya left. Rachel went to the lobby. She smelled it before she saw the full picture. The particular combination of institutional detergent and something else. Something she associated with specific kinds of gear and specific kinds of people, which was not a rational sensory memory, but was a real one. She came around the corner from the corridor and stopped. There were 9 of them this time, not 6. Price was there, toward the back. Reeves was there, having apparently been relieved from his overnight position. The others were a mix of ages and builds, but all had the same quality of occupying space in a way that accounted for everything in it. And in front of them, speaking with Gary at the desk, who looked like he genuinely was considering whether to call the police, stood a man Rachel had not seen in 4 years, 3 months, and an indeterminate number of days. Colonel Raymond Strick. He was older than she remembered, but then she was older too, and 4 years was enough time for the specific kind of age that came from the specific kind of work they had both done to become more visible on a person's face. His hair was more gray. The set of his jaw was the same. He was in uniform, which was deliberate. She understood that immediately. And the insignia on that uniform would have answered every question Gary had been trying to ask if Gary had any framework for reading it. Rachel stood in the entrance to the lobby for a moment. Strick looked up from Gary and saw her. He said nothing for a count of 3. Then he said, "Carter." Not Voss. Carter. Her service name, the one she'd buried under a hyphen in a 4-year relocation. Gary looked between them with the expression of someone who had just realized the situation was considerably larger than he'd been equipped to handle. Rachel walked across the lobby. "Colonel?" she said. "You look the same," Strick said. "You don't." Something almost like amusement crossed his face, brief and controlled. "Sergeant Thales is out of surgery." "I know, I was here for it." "I heard." He looked at her steadily. "I also heard about the attending who tried to pull you off the case. That's an internal hospital matter." "It is," Strick agreed. "For now." The 2 words sat there with more weight than they needed. He glanced around the lobby, at Gary still frozen behind the desk, at the small cluster of other early morning staff who had drifted in and were pretending not to watch. "Is there somewhere less public?" Rachel thought for a moment. "Conference room 2 is empty until 9. "Lead the way," Strick said. She led the way. Price fell in beside her without being asked, which told her something about how this was being structured. Strick walked behind them, which told her something else. 3 of the other operators positioned at the conference room entrance when they arrived, which told her everything about the operational mindset that Strick had not yet fully shifted out of. Inside, the conference room had a long table and chairs and a whiteboard that still had the remnants of a budget meeting from the previous week. Strick stood at the head of the table and didn't sit, which meant Rachel didn't sit, which meant Price didn't sit, and all 3 of them stood there for a moment in the particular way people stood when they were deciding how formal the next conversation was going to be. "I need to know what happened in that trauma base," Strick said. "Chronologically." Rachel told him. She was concise. She'd been trained to be concise in debriefs, and the training hadn't gone away, and she didn't editorialize except where the facts required context. She described the patient's presentation, her assessment, Westbrook's response, the treatment delay, the surgical outcome. Strick listened without interrupting. Price made notes on something small that he produced from a pocket. When she finished, Strick was quiet for a moment. "How long has Westbrook been doing this?" he asked. Rachel looked at him. "That's a hospital question, not a—" "How long?" Strick said, and it wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't a question anymore either. "I've been here 4 years," Rachel said carefully. In 4 years, I have observed patterns of behavior that I would characterize as a consistent prioritization of institutional reputation and personal authority over patient welfare. I have documented incidents in my personal records. I have not filed formal complaints because the administration here is aware of his behavior and has consistently chosen to protect him. Strick looked at Price. Price looked at his notes. Who in administration? Strick asked. Colonel. Rachel. It was the first time he'd used her given name. It landed differently because of that. Sergeant Thales almost died because a surgeon in this building decided his authority mattered more than a patient's life. That surgeon is the same one who is currently trying to end your career for doing your job. Rachel said nothing. I'm not here to make your choices for you, Strick said. I am here because one of my people is alive because of you, and I have a responsibility to understand the full situation. That includes the situation you have apparently been operating in for 4 years. He looked at her directly. Who in administration? Rachel thought about it for 3 seconds. Then she told him. She named 2 people. The chief medical officer, a man named Darren Holst, and the hospital's general counsel, a woman named Patricia Say, who had received documented complaints about Westbrook's conduct in the past 2 years and had responded to both with internal memos that resulted in no action. She knew this because she had filed one of those complaints herself 18 months ago after watching Westbrook berate a nurse in a patient corridor and then alter documentation to make a delayed treatment look deliberate rather than negligent. Nothing had happened. She had kept her records. Strick listened to all of it with the same expression he'd had during every debrief she'd ever sat in with him. Focused, non-reactive, processing. Okay, he said when she finished. What does that mean? She asked. It means okay, he said. We'll talk more after I've seen Sergeant Thales. He left the conference room. Price lingered for a moment after Strick walked out. He's going to pull the thread, Price said. I know. That going to be a problem for you? Rachel looked at the whiteboard with its ghost of someone else's budget meeting. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Price nodded, accepted that, and left. Rachel stood alone in the conference room for a moment, the empty chairs around her, the hum of the hospital on the other side of the walls. She had not asked for any of this. She had admitted a patient because the patient was dying. She had stayed because she didn't know how to leave something unfinished. She had told Strick what he asked because she had never, in 8 years of service and 4 years of whatever this was, been able to look the other way when the documentation was sitting right there. She picked up her coffee, which she'd carried in and set on the table and forgotten about. It was cold. She drank it anyway. At 8:47 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from an internal hospital number she recognized as belonging to the second-floor administrative suite. Dr. Westbrook is requesting your immediate presence in the chief medical officer's office. Please report by 9 a.m. She stared at the message. Then, from a different number, Price's, she'd taken it without thinking about it at some point in the night, a second message arrived. Thales is awake, asking for you. She looked at both messages for a long moment. She went upstairs to see Marcus first. He was propped up in the hospital bed, looking significantly worse than a person who had survived major surgery should have expected to look, which was to say, he looked like exactly what he was, someone who had been through something serious and was working very hard not to show how much it had taken from him. His color was off. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, or that she hadn't been able to see in the trauma bay. He was awake, though. His eyes tracked her when she came through the door. Reeves was still in the chair by the door. He stood when she entered and then sat back down. Rachel stopped at the foot of the bed. Marcus looked at her for a moment. His voice, when it came, was rougher than she expected. Anesthesia, mostly, and the particular damage that came from a breathing tube. You're Voss, he said. I am. Price said you were here all night. I went home for a few hours. A slight pause. Why? It was a genuine question, not challenging, not suspicious, just direct in the way that people who operated in certain contexts were often direct, because indirect questions wasted time that sometimes you didn't have. Rachel thought about how to answer it honestly. Because I couldn't leave something unfinished, she said. Marcus looked at her for another moment. His hand resting on top of the blanket moved slightly, not reaching, just adjusting. "You're the one Strick came for," he said. It wasn't a question. "He came for you." "He came for you," Marcus said, quiet and certain. "I've known Strick 6 years. He doesn't make house calls for surgery. He makes them when there's something else." Rachel said nothing. "Whatever you used to do," Marcus said, "it was more than nursing." "I'm a nurse," Rachel said. "Yeah." He looked at her steadily. "You're also something else." The monitor beside his bed beeped steadily. Down the hall, something metal hit a tile floor and someone swore quietly. Rachel's phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't look at it, but she knew what it was. The administrative suite. Westbrook's request. 9 a.m., which was now 11 minutes away. "Get some rest," she said to Marcus. "Carter," he said. She stopped in the doorway. "That's not my name here," she said, without turning around. "I know," Marcus said. "It's the name Strick used when he told me what you did." A pause. "He said you never changed." She walked out. In the elevator going down to the administrative floor, she looked at herself in the steel reflection of the doors. The scrubs she'd changed back into, the low ponytail, the face that didn't leave an immediate impression. The elevator opened on 3. She stepped out into a hallway that already felt different than it had yesterday. At the end of it, the door to the chief medical officer's office was closed, but through the frosted glass panel beside it, she could see shadows. Multiple people. More than she'd expected from a disciplinary meeting. She counted 4 shapes through the glass. Then a 5th one moved into view, and even through the frosted distortion she recognized the posture. Strick. Rachel stood in the hallway for a full 4 seconds, looking at that door. Then she straightened, walked to it, and pushed it open without knocking. The room went quiet when she walked in. Not the gradual quiet of people noticing someone enter. The immediate kind. The kind that meant everyone in the room had already known she was coming and had been waiting for the specific moment of her arrival. Rachel clocked it in the first half-second and kept moving, let the door fall shut behind her, and took stock of what she was walking into. Darren Holst sat behind his desk, which was large in the way that administrative desks were large, more statement than function. He was 56, soft in the jaw, with the permanent expression of someone who had spent decades managing competing interests and had learned to read which way a room was leaning before he committed to anything. Beside him stood Patricia Say, the general counsel, thin and precise in a charcoal blazer, holding a legal pad and a pen she wasn't using. 2 other men Rachel didn't recognize occupied chairs along the wall. Suits, not scrubs, which meant either administration or legal, and given that Say was already in the room, probably legal. Westbrook was standing near the window, and Strick was standing near the door, which meant he'd been the last shape she'd seen through the frosted glass, and also meant that he had positioned himself between Westbrook and the exit in a way that was probably not accidental. Rachel looked at all of it in about 2 seconds. "Ms. Voss," Holst said. He gestured toward an empty chair. "Please sit down." She sat. Westbrook didn't look at her directly. He was looking at a point slightly past her left shoulder, which she recognized as the expression of someone who had planned this conversation and was now recalibrating because the room was not what he'd expected it to be. "I've called this meeting," Holst began, in the careful tone of someone who had been briefed by legal counsel very recently, "to address several matters that have come to my attention this morning." "Several," Rachel said. "Yes." He glanced at Say. "First, the disciplinary review requested by Dr. Westbrook. Second, the unauthorized presence of federal military personnel in this facility, which I understand you facilitated. And third, another glance at Say, longer this time. Some questions about documentation." "What documentation?" Rachel asked. Say spoke for the first time. "Hospital records, patient charts, security footage from the trauma department." She said it evenly, like she was reading a grocery list. "Specifically from yesterday between 9 and 11 a.m. Westbrook's jaw tightened. Rachel kept her eyes on Holst. "Who requested that footage?" "That would be me," Strick said from near the door. Every head in the room turned toward him, except Rachel's, because she'd known he was going to say it. Holst looked at Strick with the specific expression of someone who had been tolerating a complication and had just been told the complication was larger than initially understood. Colonel Strick, I want to be clear that while we appreciate the Army's presence here, you don't, Strick said, not unkindly. And that's fine. I'm not here for appreciation. He moved just 2 steps toward the center of the room, and the subtle shift in posture that accompanied those 2 steps was the kind of thing that people didn't consciously notice but physically responded to. Both men along the wall sat slightly straighter. I'm here because a member of my unit was admitted to this facility last night in critical condition, and the circumstances of his admission have raised questions that are outside the scope of hospital administration to resolve internally. That is an extraordinary overreach of, Say began. The patient is a federal asset under active service classification, Strick said. His medical care, and any interference with that care, falls within federal medical oversight jurisdiction. I have documentation. He produced an envelope from his jacket and set it on Holst's desk without looking at him. It's also on its way electronically to your legal department. They'll have it within the hour. They picked up the envelope. She opened it. Her expression went through 3 phases in about 4 seconds. Reading, understanding, accepting, and landed somewhere that was not quite neutral, but was very close to it. This doesn't speak to Ms. Voss's disciplinary situation, Westbrook said. His voice was controlled, but the control was visible, which meant it was costing him something. No, Strick agreed. It doesn't. You're right. Something in the way he said it made Westbrook look at him properly for the first time. But the security footage does, Strick said. Would you like to talk about that now, or would you prefer to review it first? The room held very still for a moment. Then Holst said, Harlan, and it was a name spoken the way you spoke a name when you were warning someone, and Westbrook heard it, and the muscle in his jaw moved. I want to review it, Holst said to Strick, with counsel present, before any further discussion. That's reasonable, Strick said. He looked at Rachel. Ms. Voss, you're free to go. She stood. Westbrook looked at her then, directly, finally, and the look had something complicated in it. Not quite fear, not quite anger, something in between, with a layer underneath it that might have been the beginning of understanding that the ground had shifted and he hadn't felt it happening. Rachel left the room. In the hallway, she stood for a moment with her back against the wall. Same position as yesterday, same wall, different floor. The hospital hummed around her. A cart went past. 2 nurses crossed the far end of the corridor without looking at her. She breathed in slowly and out slowly, and she let herself feel the full weight of what was happening, which was not something she did often, and which she'd learned to do briefly and then set aside, because dwelling in the middle of something when it wasn't over yet was a way of spending energy you needed for what came next. What was happening was this. 4 years of keeping her head down, and her records clean, and her history buried, were over. Not because she'd made a choice exactly, but because a man had crashed his car on Route 9, and she'd been the one in the bay, and now the thread that connected her to who she'd been before Caldwell was being pulled by people who pulled threads for a living. She didn't know yet if that was going to destroy what she'd built here, or if it was going to do something else. She went back to work. The morning was strange in a way that was hard to pin down. The staff knew something was happening. The operators in the lobby had not gone unnoticed, and Strick in uniform had not gone unnoticed, and the closed-door meeting on 3 had been the subject of speculation since before shift change. People looked at Rachel differently than they had yesterday, which was to say they looked at her, which they didn't usually do. Priya asked her twice if everything was okay, and both times Rachel said yes, and both times Priya looked like she wanted to ask something else but settled for yes. At 11, Price appeared at the nurse's station. Thalis is asking to be moved, he said. Rachel looked up from the chart she was reviewing. He's 12 hours post-op. I know. He also knows he's asking anyway. Tell him no. He outranks me. He's a patient, Rachel said. In this building, I outrank him. Price looked at her for a moment, and something at the corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I'll tell him you said that. Tell him I'll come by at noon. She went at noon. Marcus was sitting up too far in the bed, which was not doctor-approved, and had the look of someone who had been trying to do too many things with a body that had recently been surgically repaired and was objecting. The drain from his side was in place. His color was marginally better than it had been at 8. He was also clearly in more pain than he was going to admit, which was a specific kind of stubborn that Rachel had seen before in people of a certain training background, and which she had zero patience for. "Lie back," she said. You have 2 repaired internal bleeds, a chest tube, and a drain. Lie back." He lay back. Slowly, with the deliberate carefulness of someone who'd been reminded that their body was currently on borrowed time. His face did something brief and involuntary when he reached horizontal that told her more about his actual pain level than anything he was going to say out loud. "You need more pain management," she said. "I need to be coherent. You need to not reopen your repairs." "Those are not mutually exclusive," Marcus said. "They are if you keep sitting up like that." She adjusted the head of the bed to a moderate incline, enough to help with his breathing, not enough to strain the repair sites. He allowed it without comment. "Price said you want to be moved." "I want to be in a position where I'm not a liability." "You're a post-surgical patient. You're supposed to be a liability. That's what recovery means." He looked at her with eyes that were sharper than his condition warranted, which was something she'd noted about him from the beginning. "Strick's people found something in the footage," he said. Rachel said nothing. "Price told me, whatever was on that footage, it's not just about you anymore." Marcus shifted slightly, and his jaw tightened with it. Westbrook wasn't just protecting his reputation yesterday. Price thinks there's a pattern. "Price thinks," Rachel said carefully. "Price ran the numbers on his outcomes, specifically on cases where an attending nurse flagged a concern and Westbrook overrode it. 6 cases in 3 years. A pause. 2 of those patients died. The hallway outside was quiet. The monitor beeped steadily. Rachel had known about one of those deaths. She had suspected a second. She had not had access to the documentation to connect them. "That's not information Price should have," she said. "He's creative with access," Marcus said. It wasn't proud, just accurate. "The point is that whatever Strick is doing in that room upstairs, it's bigger than your disciplinary review." "I know. Are you going to be okay with that?" She looked at him. It was an honest question, the same kind he'd asked at 8 this morning. Not challenging, not assuming, just asking. "I don't know," she said honestly. He nodded. That seemed to be enough. At 1:15 p.m., Holst's assistant came to find Rachel on the floor and asked her to return to the administrative suite. The assistant, a young woman named Becca, who had always been perfectly polite to Rachel and who currently looked like she was delivering a message she didn't fully understand the weight of, said it with the careful neutrality of someone following instructions rather than participating in whatever those instructions were building toward. Rachel went up. The configuration of the room had changed. Say was still there, but the 2 suit men were gone. Holst was still behind his desk. Westbrook was not there. Strick was there. And beside Strick stood a woman Rachel had not seen before. Mid-50s, civilian clothes, but carrying herself in a way that was not civilian, with a federal ID badge clipped to her jacket lapel that Rachel couldn't read from the doorway, but that Holst clearly had read and had clearly had opinions about. "Ms. Voss," Holst said. His voice was different than it had been this morning. Not weaker exactly, but more considered. "Please sit down." She sat. The woman with the badge said, "My name is Investigator Lorraine Kwok. I'm with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. I need to ask you some questions about events in the trauma department yesterday, specifically from 9 to 11 a.m. Before I do, I want to be clear." She looked at Rachel steadily. "You are not under investigation. You are a witness." "Okay," Rachel said. "Dr. Westbrook has been asked to take administrative leave pending a review of the security footage and patient records from the last 36 months. Kwok said it like she was stating a weather forecast. Just information, delivered clearly. "I understand from Colonel Strick that you have personal documentation of incidents involving Dr. Westbrook's conduct." "I do." "I'd like to request access to that documentation." Rachel looked at Strick. He looked back at her without expression, which was, from Strick, its own form of communication. "I'll need to review what I have and determine what's relevant," Rachel said. "That's fine," Kwok said. "I'd like it within 48 hours if possible." 24, Rachel said, because 48 felt like dragging it out, and she'd never been good at that. Kwok looked at her for a moment, and something in her expression shifted in the way that people's expression shifted when they were revising their understanding of who they were talking to. 24, she agreed. Rachel stood. Is that everything? Holst said, Miss Voss? She stopped. He had both hands on his desk and the expression of a man doing a calculation he wasn't enjoying. The disciplinary review that Dr. Westbrook requested. I'm withdrawing it. Rachel looked at him. Given the circumstances, he said. Given the circumstances, she repeated. There was a beat of something in the room. Not satisfaction exactly, more like the specific gravity of a thing that had been wrong for a long time, beginning its slow process of becoming right. It wasn't clean, it wasn't complete, but it was real. She left. The afternoon was different again, a third register after the night and the morning, something she didn't have an easy word for. The investigation was real now. Kwok's people had access to the hospital records system, which Rachel knew because Dr. Asante told her, quietly, in the stairwell at 2:30, that someone had been in the records department since noon pulling files. Word moved fast in a hospital. By 3 p.m., the staff knew something significant was happening to Westbrook, though they didn't know the full shape of it yet. The looks Rachel got shifted again, less curious, more searching, like people trying to fit a new piece into a picture they'd been looking at for years. Priya found her in the supply room at 3:15. People are saying he's been suspended, Priya said. Administrative leave, Rachel said. That's different from suspension. Is it? Procedurally, yes. Priya was quiet for a moment, reorganizing a shelf that didn't need reorganizing. He wrote the complaint about you, the disciplinary thing. I know. And now he's the one on leave. That's how it looks. Priya put down the supplies she was holding and turned. What did you do? Before here. Before this hospital. Rachel looked at her. You don't have to answer, Priya said quickly. You're not what I thought you were. I don't mean that badly. I mean, I've been watching you for 6 weeks, and I thought I had a pretty good read on you, and today I keep having to revise it. Rachel considered how to answer that. I was a medic, she said. In the Army, for 8 years. Priya absorbed that. Combat? Yes. Is that... She stopped, started again. Is that why you're so calm? When things are bad, you get more calm, not less. Rachel thought about that for a moment. It's not calm exactly, she said. It's more like the noise goes quiet when there's something that needs doing. I want to be able to do that, Priya said. You already do it, Rachel said, more than you think. 6 weeks ago, you held a patient's hand through a procedure for 40 minutes because nobody else was staying. That's not nothing. Priya looked surprised and then tried to not look surprised and did not entirely succeed. Rachel picked up the supplies she'd come in for and left. Marcus Thales's condition improved through the afternoon in the incremental, non-linear way that post-surgical recovery actually looked. Better by some measures, uncomfortable in new ways in others. The chest tube producing what it was supposed to produce, the repair sites holding. Rachel checked his chart at 4 and again at 6 and found nothing that alarmed her, which was not the same as finding nothing to watch. She made notes. She flagged 2 things for the night team. She did what she did. At 6:40, Price appeared in the doorway of the room where she was updating notes at a mobile workstation. Strick wants to see you, he said. Now? He's waiting in the conference room. Rachel saved what she was working on. Tell him I'll be 5 minutes. It was 4. She knocked, which she hadn't done this morning, and Strick said, come in, and she did. He was sitting this time, which was new. He had his jacket off, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled to the forearm, and he was holding a paper coffee cup that looked like it had been through several hours of intermittent use. He looked tired in the particular way that people who were very good at not looking tired looked tired, around the eyes, mostly. Sit down, he said. She sat. Kwok's team is requesting a federal review of Westbrook's caseload going back 5 years, Strick said. She put it through this afternoon. Holst is cooperating. Say told him not to fight it. She was smart to, Rachel said. The 2 deaths Price identified are being re-examined. There may be others. He looked at his coffee cup. This is going to be public. Not tomorrow, but soon. I know. When it is, he stopped, reorganized. Your name is going to come up, Carter Voss, not just Voss. There it was. Rachel had known this was coming from the moment she'd seen the Meridian text on her phone in the parking structure, but knowing something was coming and having it arrive in front of you were different experiences. My service record, she said. Yes. It was sealed. It was classified, Strick said. There's a distinction. Sealed means buried. Classified means it exists and is protected. He looked at her directly. Kwok's office has access. For what purpose? To establish the credibility of the primary witness in a federal medical negligence investigation. He said it carefully, like he was laying it out in front of her deliberately. Your service record, Rachel, is not a liability in this context. It is the opposite. Rachel looked at the whiteboard. Someone had cleaned it since this morning. The ghost of the budget meeting was gone. You knew, she said. Not accusatory, just noting it. I suspected, Strick said. When Ferris called me last night and told me the nurse who caught what the surgeon missed had been the one the surgeon tried to remove from the case, I suspected. A pause. Then Price ran the numbers on Westbrook's outcomes, and I stopped suspecting. What did you do? I called Kwok, he said. She's been tracking Westbrook for 8 months. A complaint came in through a different channel. She didn't have enough to move. We gave her enough to move. Rachel absorbed that. The documentation you're giving her in 24 hours, Strick said. Is it solid? It's solid. All of it? Dates, specifics, no gaps? All of it, she said. I'm a medic, Colonel. I document. Something passed through his expression. Not quite a smile, but the closest he'd come in the years she'd known him. I know. They sat in silence for a moment. What happens after? Rachel asked. To you? To all of it. The unit. Thales. You. Strick turned his coffee cup in his hands. Thales will recover and return to duty. The unit will continue. I will... He stopped. I don't know what happens after. I know what needs to happen first, and after that we'll see. It was the most honest answer she'd ever heard him give about anything, which told her something about how serious this had gotten. She stood. I'll have the documentation to Kwok by tomorrow morning, she said. One more thing, Strick said. She stopped. Your service record. When it becomes relevant to the investigation, and it will, it's going to be difficult for this hospital to maintain the disciplinary review, even if Holst hadn't already withdrawn it. He already withdrew it. I know, but there's a difference between a withdrawn complaint and an acknowledged record. Strick stood and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. What you did here, in this hospital, for 4 years, it's going to look very different once people understand who was doing it. Rachel looked at him. I didn't do it for recognition, she said. I know that, he said. That's exactly why it's going to matter. She left the conference room. The evening shift change was at 7, and she was in the middle of handoff when the code blue went out. Not for her floor. 2 floors up. The cardiac unit, which was its own department with its own team, and a code blue there meant nothing that was Rachel's problem. She registered it the way anyone working in a hospital registered a code that wasn't in their area. Acknowledged, filed, not yours. She finished handoff. She was pulling on her jacket in the break room at 7:22 when Price came through the door at a controlled walk that was on the outer edge of a run. Thales is coding, he said. Rachel was moving before he finished the sentence. She covered the distance to the stairs in 12 seconds, and the stairs in 20 more, and the hallway of the recovery floor in 8, and she was through the door of Marcus's room at 7:25 with the crash team already arriving behind her, and she looked at the monitor and looked at the patient and looked at the nurse who'd been on duty. A competent night nurse named Ophelia who was already doing the right things, but doing them with the controlled fear of someone managing a situation at the edge of her experience. Talk to me, Rachel said. V-fib, just started, no preceding rhythm change on the record. He was sitting up. He was sitting up? He asked me to adjust the bed, and I came in and... Rachel looked at the repair site dressing. Clean. No external evidence of re-bleed. She looked at the monitor and the rhythm and the timeline, and a picture assembled itself in front of her that was not the picture anyone in this room was currently working from. "This isn't the repairs," she said. "Defib's ready," someone said. "Hold," Rachel said. "Ms. Voss?" "Hold." She was at the medication record, moving fast through the entries. 12 hours of medications, all appropriate. Except, she stopped, went back 3 lines. "Who authorized this combination?" Ophelia was behind her. "That was the afternoon order. Doctor?" "This was contraindicated with the sedation still in his system," Rachel said. "The half-life overlaps." She turned. "Get me the attending, not a resident. Get me Okafor or whoever else is senior and get them now. And tell them we're looking at a drug interaction, not a cardiac event." The room moved differently after that. Still urgent, but with a different target, and different meant faster, because everyone in the room had shifted from managing a symptom to managing a cause. Rachel was at the bedside when Marcus came back. Not all the way. He was still badly compromised, his heart rhythm stuttering back toward something workable. His color the color of someone who had just spent 2 minutes somewhere very close to the edge. But his eyes opened, briefly, and they found her face the way eyes found something to anchor to when the rest of everything was uncertain. She was there. He was there. That was what mattered for the next 30 seconds. Then the attending arrived, and Rachel stepped back and gave the room what it needed, which was her expertise without her presence at the center. And she stood at the back and watched and gave information when asked, and held herself steady. At 7:58 p.m., Marcus Thallis's heart was in normal sinus rhythm. At 8:03 p.m., the attending, Dr. Okafor, who had been called back in on her way home and had arrived in 4 minutes, which said everything about what she was as a physician, identified the precise interaction in the medication record and corrected the order. At 8:11 p.m., Rachel was standing in the hallway outside Marcus's room with Price beside her, both of them not speaking, the way people didn't speak when they were coming down from something at volume and hadn't yet found the right register for normal. "That order," Price said finally. "It was a mistake," Rachel said, "or it looked like one." Price looked at her. "You're not sure?" "I need to see who wrote it," she said. Price took out his phone. He was on it for 45 seconds. Then he lowered it. The name of the physician who had written the afternoon order was Harlan Westbrook, written at 3:47 p.m., 2 hours after he had been placed on administrative leave, which should have, and in any normal functioning of the system would have, removed his ability to enter orders in the hospital system. Rachel stared at the name on Price's screen. The hospital was quiet around them, the quiet of a thing that had not finished yet, that was still moving toward whatever it was going to become. And somewhere in the building, Kwok's team was working through records, and Holst was managing what he hadn't managed for years, and Westbrook's name was on a medication order that had just put a federal patient into cardiac arrest, and Rachel was standing in a hallway at 8:11 p.m. with the specific, cold clarity of a person who understood that this had stopped being a workplace grievance somewhere in the last 24 hours and had become something else entirely. Price looked at her. "You need to call Kwok," he said. "I know," Rachel said. She was already dialing. Kwok picked up on the second ring. Rachel told her in 40 seconds. No preamble, no framing, just the facts in the order they mattered. The code, the rhythm, the medication record, the name at the bottom of the order, the timestamp. 47 words. She'd been trained to give situation reports in under a minute, and that training did not go away. Kwok was quiet for 2 seconds after Rachel stopped talking. "Don't touch the record," she said. "Screenshot it, send it to this number, and don't touch it. It's already in the system. It can't be untouched. Then make sure no one amends it. I need it exactly as it was entered." A brief pause, the sound of movement on her end. "I'm 20 minutes out. Keep Price with you." The line went dead. Rachel lowered the phone and looked at Price. 20 minutes. "I heard." He was already moving toward Marcus's room. "I'm going to put 2 people at this door. Nobody in or out without my clearance or yours. He needs medical access. Medical access, fine. Anyone else, they come through me first." Rachel didn't argue. She sent the screenshot to Kwok's number, then stood in the hallway with the phone in her hand and thought about what a physician on administrative leave entering an order into a hospital's medication system at 3:47 p.m. actually required. It required active system credentials. Credentials that should have been suspended the moment Holst issued the administrative leave, which meant either the credentials hadn't been suspended, a procedural failure possible, the kind of thing that happened in overwhelmed IT departments, or they had been suspended and someone had reinstated them, which was a different kind of failure entirely. She went to find Ophelia. The night nurse was at the workstation down the hall, hands shaking slightly in the way hands shook after a code when the adrenaline was still working through the system. She had a cup of water she wasn't drinking. "Ophelia," Rachel said, keeping her voice level. "When the afternoon orders came in for Thales, did you review them before administering?" "Yes." Ophelia looked up. "I reviewed them. They looked correct. The combination, I didn't have a flag in the system." "Because the flag should have been generated when the order was entered," Rachel said. "If the prescribing physician's credentials were properly suspended, the system wouldn't have accepted the order at all. The flag didn't generate because the order went through clean." Ophelia's face went through several things quickly. "Are you saying it's not my fault?" "I'm saying the system failed before you saw it," Rachel said. "Yes." Ophelia put down the water. "Who wrote it?" "That's being investigated." "Rachel," Ophelia's voice was steadier now, the shock having converted into something more functional. "I need to know. He's my patient too." Rachel looked at her for a moment. "Westbrook," she said. "The timestamp is after his leave was issued." Ophelia stared at her. Then she said, quietly and with precision, a word that was not appropriate for a hospital hallway, and Rachel did not blame her for it. "The IT department keeps access logs," Ophelia said. "Every credential use, every login." "I know." "If someone reinstated his access, it'll be in the logs," Rachel said. "Kwok's people will pull them." Ophelia nodded. She was still processing, but she was processing faster now, converting the shock into something she could use. Rachel recognized that quality in her and made a note of it for reasons that were not entirely professional, but were not entirely not professional either. She went back to the hallway. Kwok arrived in 18 minutes, not 20. She came with two people Rachel hadn't seen before, a man and a woman, both carrying the particular purposefulness of people who did a specific thing well and were currently doing it. No wasted movement, no explanation of who they were or what they were there for. They moved toward the nurse's station with Kwok's authorization clipped to her lapel, and Kwok herself went directly to Rachel. "Show me the room," Kwok said. Rachel showed her the room. Kwok looked at Marcus, stable, conscious, exhausted, watching them with the alert stillness of someone who had recently been dead, adjacent and was taking nothing for granted. And she looked at the monitoring equipment, and she looked at the medication chart that Rachel pulled up on the bedside terminal. And she looked at Westbrook's name and timestamp without any visible reaction, which Rachel was beginning to understand was just how Kwok processed things. "Colonel Strick needs to be in this conversation," Kwok said. "He's at his hotel," Price said from the doorway. 10 minutes. "Get him!" Price stepped out. Kwok turned to Rachel. "Walk me through the interaction, the specific pharmacology." Rachel walked her through it. The sedation agent still metabolizing from surgery. The half-life. The medication Westbrook had ordered that competes for the same hepatic pathway. The cumulative effect on cardiac conduction. She used the correct terminology and didn't slow down for Kwok to catch up. And Kwok did not need her to, which confirmed something Rachel had already suspected about her. "How long between the order entry and administration?" Kwok asked. "Approximately 3 hours. The order was entered at 3:47 and administered at the 6:30 medication pass." "So it was in the system for 3 hours?" "Yes. And no flag generated." "No." Kwok was quiet for a moment. "If you hadn't caught it—" "I caught it," Rachel said. "Not dismissive, just accurate." "If you hadn't been in this building tonight," Kwok said, which was a different version of the same sentence. "If you had gone home at the end of your shift and not come back." Rachel didn't answer that. There was no useful answer to hypotheticals about what would have happened if she had done the things she'd been incapable of doing. Strick arrived at 8:43 p.m., and the room reorganized itself around his arrival the way rooms did, not because he demanded it, but because of the specific gravity of someone who had spent decades being the person situations resolved around. He looked at Marcus first, a quick professional assessment that was also something more personal, and Marcus looked back at him, and the exchange between them was brief and wordless, and contained more than a longer conversation would have. Then Strick looked at Kwok. "Tell me," Kwok told him. His face did not move during the telling. When she finished, he said, "He's still in the system." "Was," Kwok said. "My people have already suspended his credentials, but the IT logs are going to tell us who reinstated them after the administrative leave was issued, and when, and from which terminal." "How long for the logs?" "They're pulling them now, probably an hour." Strick looked at Rachel. She knew what the look was asking and answered the question it contained. "The order was clinically specific," she said. "The interaction isn't obscure, but it's not the kind of thing you'd hit on by accident. You'd need to know the patient's current medication profile, and you'd need to know the pharmacology of the sedation agent well enough to understand where the vulnerability was." "Meaning," Strick said. "Meaning it wasn't a mistake," Rachel said. "Or if it was a very informed one." The hallway outside had gotten quieter. The second-floor corridor ran along the north face of the building, and through the window at the far end, the parking lot lights were visible against the dark. Hargrove Memorial at 9 p.m. was a reduced version of itself. Less staff, less noise, the same building doing the same work with fewer people in it, which meant every conversation carried farther and every footstep announced itself. Kwok's two people came back at 9:11 p.m. The woman handed Kwok a tablet. Kwok looked at it for a moment. Then she handed it to Strick, and Strick looked at it, and he handed it to Rachel. The IT access log showed two entries. The first, Westbrook's credentials suspended at 1:34 p.m., authorized by administrative user DH-04, which Rachel recognized as Darren Holst's administrative login. That part was as it should have been. The second entry, Westbrook's credentials reinstated at 3:31 p.m., 16 minutes before the medication order was entered, authorized by administrative user PS-02, Patricia Say, the general counsel. Rachel stared at the log. Strick said, quietly, to no one in particular, "There it is." The next 2 hours were not dramatic in the way that movies made things dramatic. They were procedural smut. Phone calls, documentation, the systematic and unglamorous work of people who built cases doing what they were trained to do. Kwok's people went to find Holst. Two federal officers Rachel had not previously seen appeared in the hospital at 10:15 p.m. with documentation she was not shown and did not ask to see. Price moved his people into different positions without explaining the repositioning to anyone. Rachel went and sat with Marcus. He was awake. He looked terrible. The cardiac event had cost him something that surgery alone hadn't, an additional depletion that showed in the flatness around his eyes and the careful way he was managing his breathing. But he was tracking, and he was clearly running through things the way he ran through things, which was to say systematically and without a great deal of wasted motion. Strick's expression when he came in, Marcus said. "That bad?" "It got complicated," Rachel said. "How complicated?" "The medication order was entered after Westbrook was placed on leave. His credentials were reinstated by someone else to allow it." Marcus processed that. "The lawyer. How did you—" "She was the one who pushed hardest in the meeting this morning," Price told me. He shifted slightly and his jaw tightened briefly. "She had something to protect." "Apparently. Has she been arrested?" "I don't know what's happening with her right now," Rachel said honestly. "Kwok's people are dealing with it." Marcus looked at the ceiling. The monitor beside him beeped with the steady patience of a machine that had no opinion about anything. "You should go home," he said. "You're the second person who said that to me tonight." "Were they wrong?" Rachel thought about it. "Probably not." "Then go home." "I'll go when I know you're stable." He looked at her. "I'm stable." "You coded 3 hours ago." "And I'm stable now." He said it without force, just as a fact. "Rachel, go home. I'm not going anywhere." A pause. "Reeves is outside. Price is in the building. Strick is in the building. You have given this hospital everything you had today and yesterday, and I think probably for 4 years before that." He stopped, rearranged. "I'm not good at saying things like this, but you don't have to stay." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Your drain output is slightly higher than I'd like. Tell the night nurse if it increases. Don't try to sit up past 45 degrees. And if you feel any chest pressure, I'll yell," Marcus said. "You'll use the call button." "I'll use the call button." She left. The parking lot at 11 p.m. was cold in the way Caldwell got cold in autumn. Not brutal yet, but with an edge that meant something. Rachel sat in her car for a moment before starting it. The hospital behind her was lit up the way hospitals always were, the permanent daylight of a building that didn't know how to stop. She thought about the IT log, the 2 entries, the 16 minutes between suspension and reinstatement, which was exactly enough time for a phone call between a physician on administrative leave and a general counsel who had spent 2 years receiving complaints about him and making them go away. She thought about Priya in the supply room asking why she got calm when things got bad. She thought about Marcus saying you don't have to stay. She started the car and drove home. Her apartment was a second-floor unit in a building that was 14 minutes from Hargrove Memorial, which she had chosen deliberately when she moved to Caldwell. Not close enough to feel like an extension of work, close enough to get back fast if she had to. She had furnished it with the practicality of someone who didn't accumulate things: a bed, a desk, a couch that was functional rather than comfortable, bookshelves that were full because books were the one thing she had consistently allowed herself. The kitchen was cleaner than it had any right to be given how little she cooked. She showered. She ate something from the refrigerator that required no preparation. She sat at her desk and opened the personal records she'd told Kwok about, a folder on an encrypted drive, meticulously dated, specific enough to be useful and organized enough to be navigated by someone who hadn't created it. She went through it for 2 hours. There were 11 documented incidents. She had known there were 11. She went through each one and confirmed that the documentation said what she remembered it saying, and she looked for gaps, and she found 2 places where her notes were thorough, but where the supporting evidence, a chart timestamp, a witness who had been present, would require corroboration she didn't have alone. She flagged those 2. She wrote notes in the margins of her own documentation explaining the gaps and what could fill them. She was not going to hand Kwok a package with holes she hadn't already identified. At 1:30 a.m., she saved the folder, encrypted it, and went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about the IT log and Patricia Say's administrative login and what that meant about how long the 2 of them had been working in concert. Say had been at Hargrove Memorial for 7 years. Westbrook had been there for 9. The complaints had started, the ones Rachel knew about, 2 years ago, though she suspected the behavior predated the documentation by considerably. She thought about the 2 patients who had died. She thought about them by the information she had. A 63-year-old male, cardiac comorbidities, delayed intervention on a bleed that should have been caught earlier. A 41-year-old woman, post-surgical complication, documentation that listed the cause of death as consistent with her presenting condition, but which, if you read it alongside the timeline of Westbrook's decisions in the preceding 6 hours, raised questions that should have been raised at the time and hadn't been. She had put both of those in her folder, under their own section, clearly labeled with every caveat she could think of about the limits of what she could establish from nursing records without surgical review. Kwok's people would do the surgical review. At some point she slept. Her phone rang at 6:14 a.m. Kwok. Westbrook was detained at his home at 5 this morning, Kwok said. Say was detained separately at 5:40. Holst has been advised not to leave the city pending further review. He may have known about the credential reinstatement and failed to act. We're still establishing that. Rachel sat up in bed. The 2 deaths. Under full review. The surgical records from both cases are with our medical consultants. A brief pause. Rachel. The credential reinstatement, Say's login was used, but the forensic team found a second authorization flag buried in the system entry. It's technical. I won't go into the full detail, but the short version is that the reinstatement was requested from a terminal in Westbrook's home office. Say processed it from her laptop remotely. He called her? He called her, Kwok confirmed. We have the phone records. Rachel stood up and walked to the window. The street below was doing its early morning routine. One car, a dog walker, the particular thin light of a weekday just starting. The criminal referral is going to the U.S. Attorney's Office today, Kwok said. Federal charges given the patient involved. The state medical board is being notified simultaneously. His license will be suspended pending the outcome. Another pause. I need your documentation by 9. I'll have it to you by 8, Rachel said. She was at her desk in 20 minutes. She spent 45 on the final review of the folder, added the margin notes she'd written last night as a separate document so Kwok could read them alongside the main file, and sent the encrypted package to Kwok's secure email address at 7:52 a.m. She arrived at Hargrove Memorial at 8:30. The hospital was different. She felt it before she understood it. Some shift in the atmosphere that wasn't visible in any single thing but was present in the aggregate. Staff moved differently. Conversation stopped and restarted when she passed. Gary at the main desk looked at her when she came through the entrance and then looked away with the specific quality of someone who had spent the past 12 hours reconsidering several things. She went upstairs. Marcus was sitting up at the approved 45-degree incline. She noted that, and was eating something from a hospital tray with the expression of a man who found the food objectionable but was too pragmatic to refuse nutrition. Price was in the chair by the door. Reeves was gone, presumably off rotation. Kwok called me at 6:30, Marcus said when she came in. She called me at 6:14, Rachel said. He's been arrested. Yes, Marcus put down the fork. How do you feel? It was the same kind of direct question he'd been asking her since he woke up. Not intrusive, just honest, the kind of question that assumed you were capable of a real answer and wanted one. Rachel thought about it. I feel like it's not finished yet, she said, because of the 2 deaths. Because of the 2 deaths, she agreed, and because Holst is still in his office, and because whatever allowed this to go on for as long as it did doesn't go away just because 2 people have been arrested. Marcus nodded slowly. You're going to stay. I'm a nurse, she said. This is where I work. He looked at her for a moment, and in the look there was something that was not quite the thing she'd have called admiration from him, because it wasn't that simple. It was something closer to recognition, the way you recognized a person who was built the same way you were built, from the same specific combination of things, even if the shape of it looked different from the outside. Strick wants to do something formal, Marcus said. I know, he mentioned it. He's serious about it. Strick is serious about everything. More serious than usual, Marcus said. He stopped. Chose. He doesn't do this. He doesn't go to hospitals and sit in conference rooms and call federal investigators for nurses. He does it for people who are his. You understand? Rachel understood. I left, she said. I made a choice to leave. That means something. It means you left, Marcus said. It doesn't mean you stopped being what you were. She didn't have an answer to that. She wasn't sure she needed one. The morning passed the way mornings passed after something large had happened. The work continuing because the work didn't stop. The paperwork accumulating because it always accumulated. The patients needing what patients needed regardless of what was happening in the administrative floors above them. Rachel moved through it in the way she always moved through it, which was the only way she knew. At 11:15, Holst called her to his office. He was alone. No Saye, no lawyers. He looked like a man who had slept badly and was currently experiencing the specific exhaustion of someone who understood that the decisions they'd made over several years were in the process of being fully accounted for. I wanted to speak with you directly, he said. Rachel sat down without being asked. She'd decided somewhere around the 3rd floor that she was done waiting to be invited to sit. I want you to know, Holst said, that I did not know about the credential reinstatement. I believe you, Rachel said. She did, provisionally. That doesn't address what you did know. He was quiet. The complaints? Rachel said. The 2 I know about personally, and however many others went through this office in the last 7 years. You knew about his conduct. You chose the institution over the patients who were under his care. Holst looked at his desk. I made decisions I thought were in the best interest of the hospital. You made decisions that were in the best interest of Harlan Westbrook, Rachel said. The hospital was the justification. He didn't argue. That at least told her something. The review of my employment status, she said. I want it formally resolved. In writing, today. It's already been withdrawn. In writing, Rachel said, with a statement from this office acknowledging that no disciplinary action is pending and no record of the complaint will appear in my personnel file. Holst looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I'll have it on your desk by 3. She stood. Thank you. She was at the door when he said, Ms. Voss? She stopped. I understand there may be further review of this office's role in what happened. I'm cooperating fully. Good, Rachel said. You should. She left. At 2:47 p.m., Kwok's assistant emailed a preliminary notice that the federal criminal referral had been formally submitted. At 3:12 p.m., the state medical board issued an emergency license suspension for Harlan Westbrook pending full investigation. At 3:30 p.m., a written statement from Holst's office cleared Rachel's personnel file of any record of the Westbrook complaint. At 3:31 p.m., Priya found Rachel at the nurse's station and stood there for a moment before saying anything. People are talking, Priya said, about what you did. About all of it. People always talk, Rachel said. Not like this. Priya hesitated. Someone pulled your personnel file this morning. Not from Kwok's office, from inside the hospital. And apparently there are things in there that nobody... She stopped. Started again. People are saying you were more than a medic. Rachel looked up from the chart. Who pulled the file? She asked. I don't know. But whatever they found, Priya's expression was doing something complicated. Rachel, whatever's in that file, people are going to know by tomorrow. Rachel looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the door at the end of the corridor, where Price had just appeared and was walking toward her with the particular pace of someone who had something to say and was saying it with his feet before he arrived. He stopped in front of her. Strick wants you downstairs, he said. Now. What happened? Someone leaked your service record to a local news outlet, Price said. Full designation, full citation record. It went up 20 minutes ago. He looked at her steadily. It's not just local. It's already moving. Rachel stood very still for a moment. Priya said something beside her, but she didn't hear it clearly. She heard the citation record. Full designation, the specific unit, the specific operations, the specific awards that did not appear on resumes because they couldn't, that didn't appear on walls because the people who earned them had agreed they wouldn't, that existed only in sealed documents in government databases and in the memories of people who had been there, sealed until someone had opened them. Who leaked it? Rachel asked. Price's jaw was tight. We're working on that. Price. Her voice was level. Who leaked it? He looked at her for a long moment. The access log shows it came from inside this building, he said. From a terminal in the administrative suite. A pause. Holst's login at 11:04 this morning. Rachel thought about the meeting at 11:15. Holst across his desk, telling her he was cooperating fully. The terminal timestamp was 11 minutes before she'd walked into his office. 11 minutes. Rachel stood at the nurse's station and did the math one more time because the math kept coming back the same way. Holst had accessed the sealed record at 11:04. He had called her to his office at 11:15. He had sat across from her and said, I'm cooperating fully, while the thing he had just done was already moving through a news cycle she couldn't stop. Price was watching her face. He panicked, Price said. When Kwok's people started pulling records this morning, he panicked and he tried to control the narrative before it controlled him, make you the story instead of him. It won't work, Rachel said. No, Price agreed, but it's going to be loud for a while. She handed the chart she was holding to Priya, who took it without a word, and she walked to the elevator and went down to the lobby where Strick was waiting. He was standing near the window that faced the parking lot, not pacing, just standing, which from Strick meant he was running through options and had not yet landed on the one he preferred. He looked at her when she came in, and there was something in the look that was as close to an apology as Strick was capable of producing, which was not very close, but she could read it. I should have moved faster on his access, Strick said. When we went into the meeting this morning, I should have had someone pull his credentials then. You were pulling Westbrook's, Rachel said. You can only do so many things at once. That's not Strick. She stopped him with the name the same way he'd stopped her with hers the day before. What's already out there? He pulled out his phone and showed her. The article was from a local outlet, the Caldwell Courier-Herald, which was not a large publication, but was the kind of outlet that got picked up when the story was large enough, and this story was already being picked up. The headline used her full name, her service name, Rachel Carter Voss. It listed the unit designation, which should not have been listable. It referenced 3 of the citations from her record, 2 of which were classified at a level that required specific clearance to access, and which Holst had somehow accessed through whatever back channel his administrative user credentials had opened. She read it twice. The citations, she said. He had access to classified citations through an administrative hospital terminal? No, Strick said. He didn't. The IT forensics team spent the last 20 minutes on it. He took the phone back. His login was used, but the level of access on those specific files required a second credential layer that his login doesn't have. Somebody used his terminal and his login, but the access came from a credentialed federal account. Rachel looked at him. Say, she said. Say was detained at 5:40 this morning, Strick said, but her credentials weren't suspended until 6:15 when Kwok's team processed the IT hold. There's a 35-minute window. She accessed my service record from detention? From her phone, Strick said, before they took it. She had Holst's terminal credentials because she'd used them before. The IT log shows 2 prior instances. And she used them one more time from her phone to pull your file and feed it to the outlet, and then she handed over the phone. Rachel considered that. The precision of it. The spite in it. Not panicked, like Holst, but deliberate. A person going down making sure they took the thing they thought would hurt most on their way. Does Kwok know? Rachel asked. Kwok has been on the phone for the last 40 minutes, Strick said. The federal charges against Saye now include unauthorized access to classified military personnel records and deliberate disclosure of classified information. That's a different category than what she was facing this morning. The outlet, Rachel said. The article is already up. Kwok's office is in contact with them. The specific classified citations are going to be removed. What can't be removed is already out there. Your name, your unit designation, the general fact of your service record. He paused. I'm sorry. That part of it is done. Rachel looked at the parking lot through the window. A car pulled in and parked, and a woman got out carrying flowers, which meant she was visiting someone, which meant somewhere in this building a patient was about to see a person they were glad to see, and that was still the thing this building was actually for, underneath everything else that had happened in it in the past 36 hours. It was going to come out anyway, Rachel said, when Kwok's investigation went public. Not like this, not on someone else's terms. No, she agreed, not like this. She was quiet for a moment. What do you need me to do? She asked. Strick looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who had expected to spend the next 10 minutes managing her reaction and had just been told there wasn't one to manage. Kwok wants a statement from you, he said. On the record. About Westbrook, Saye, the credential reinstatement, the medication order. Everything from your direct knowledge. I can do that? Today. I know. And he stopped. The unit commander wants to formalize the acknowledgement, the recognition. He wants it done here, at this hospital, with your staff present, if you agree. Rachel looked at him. When? His preference is now, this afternoon, before the news cycle gets ahead of it. She thought about that. The thing about Strick wanting to do it now, this afternoon, in this building where she had worked for 4 years and been dismissed and overridden and pulled off cases and had a disciplinary complaint written against her by a man who was currently in federal custody. The thing about doing it here, in front of people who had watched all of that, was that it was not a subtle move. Strick didn't make subtle moves when blunt ones were available and justified. All right, she said. He nodded once. I'll make the calls. Kwok arrived at noon, and the statement took an hour and a half. They used the same conference room that had hosted 3 different difficult conversations in the past day, which by this point had accumulated a kind of history that Rachel suspected the whiteboard and the budget meeting ghost and the uncomfortable chairs would not outlive. Kwok was thorough and direct, and asked questions that occasionally required Rachel to think before answering, not because she didn't know the answer, but because some of the answers were more complex than a single response could hold. At one point, Kwok asked, "In your assessment, were the 2 patient deaths preventable?" Rachel was quiet for 4 seconds. "In my assessment," she said carefully, "the decisions made by the attending physician in both cases were inconsistent with the standard of care in ways that I documented at the time and that should have been reviewed then. Whether the outcome would have been different with different decisions, that's a question for your medical consultants. What I can tell you is that the concern was raised and it was not heard." Kwok wrote something down. "By whom? Who raised it?" "I did," Rachel said. "On one occasion. A resident did on the other. I have documentation of both." Kwok nodded and kept writing. When the statement was done, Rachel signed it and walked out of the conference room and stood in the hallway and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just put on the record, which was considerable, and which she did not regret, and which was also not easy. Priya was at the end of the hall. She had been there for an indeterminate amount of time, doing something at a mobile workstation that may or may not have required her to be precisely at that location. When Rachel came out of the conference room, she looked up and her expression had the quality of someone who wanted to say something and hadn't found the form for it yet. "I saw the article," Priya said. "I know." "I didn't know. About any of it." "No one here did," Rachel said. "That was the point." Priya was quiet for a moment. "The patients you lost," she said. "The 2. I read the names in the article." Rachel waited. "I was still in nursing school when the woman died," Priya said. "Mrs. Alderton. She's why I wanted to go into trauma nursing. She was my aunt's friend, and my aunt was devastated, and I remember thinking that if someone had caught it, if someone had been paying attention." She stopped. "I didn't know there was documentation, that someone had been paying attention." Rachel looked at her. "I was paying attention," she said. "I just didn't have enough leverage yet. But now you do." "Now the right people do," Rachel said, which was different and mattered, and Priya seemed to understand the distinction without it being spelled out. At 3 in the afternoon, the lobby of Hargrove Memorial became a different kind of place. Strick had made his calls. The unit commander had driven from wherever he'd been. Rachel didn't ask, and the answer would probably have been classified anyway. And he arrived in a black vehicle with 2 additional personnel and the specific composure of someone who had attended formal military recognitions before and understood that this one was not a routine ceremony, but was something he was choosing to make public because public was the point. His name was Colonel Ashford Briggs. He was 60, silver-haired, with the worn-in authority of someone who had stopped needing to prove things some years ago and now simply was what he was. He shook Rachel's hand in the lobby in front of Holst's receptionist and 2 administrative staff who had wandered out to see what was happening, and then he said, "Is there somewhere we can do this properly?" "The lobby is fine," Rachel said. He looked at her. "You want it here." "I want it where people can see it," she said. "Yes." Something moved in his face that was not a smile but came from the same place as one. "Right," he said. "Here." Word moved fast inside a hospital, which Rachel had always known. It moved faster when something was happening in the lobby, which was the building's main artery, its public face, the place that everyone passed through. By 3:15, there were more people in and around the lobby than could have been there by coincidence. Nurses who had finished their break and not gone back upstairs yet, techs who were passing through, Priya standing near the reception desk with her badge still clipped to her scrubs and her eyes tracking everything, Gary at the main desk looking like he was witnessing something he was going to spend considerable time thinking about later. Okafor was there. She had come in from somewhere. Rachel didn't know if she'd been called or had heard and come herself, and it didn't matter. Strick stood to the side with Price and 2 of the other operators, and whatever his expression was doing, it was the most Rachel had seen on his face in the 4 years since she'd last seen him. Marcus was not there because Marcus was 2 floors up and still attached to a drain, which was the only legitimate reason for his absence and which she could tell from his text at 3:08 p.m. he was deeply unhappy about. The text had said, "Give me 20 minutes," and she had replied, "Stay in the bed," and he had replied something that she chose to interpret as agreement. Briggs stood in front of her and the lobby quieted in stages, conversations dropping, movement slowing, the ambient noise of a hospital's public space reducing itself to background as the people in it recognized that whatever was happening at the center of the room required a different register of attention. He didn't do a long preamble. That wasn't the kind of man he was. 4 years ago, Briggs said, and his voice carried without him raising it, a soldier left our ranks to pursue something she believed she could do in a different arena. That was her choice to make, and she made it, and we respected it even when we didn't fully understand it. He looked at Rachel directly. 2 nights ago, that same soldier identified a critically wounded member of a classified federal unit, made the call to intervene over the explicit objection of a senior physician, and saved that soldier's life. Subsequent events in this hospital confirmed what those of us who served with her already knew, that what she carried out of the service did not stay in the service. It came with her. It has been here the whole time. The lobby was very quiet. The Army does not typically conduct formal recognitions in hospital lobbies, Briggs said. We're doing it here because this is where it belongs. He reached into the jacket of his uniform and produced a case, small, rectangular, the kind that Rachel recognized without having to see the inside. The Distinguished Service Commendation with citation for actions taken in the line of duty during active service, previously sealed pending the conclusion of associated classified operations, now authorized for release. He opened the case and showed her what was in it, and she looked at it and did not let her face do whatever it wanted to do. And a formal letter of recognition from the Office of the Army Surgeon General for the actions of 2 nights ago, presented here because the actions occurred here. He held out the case. She took it. Her hand was steady. She was aware of that. She was aware of the lobby, of the people in it, of Priya's face near the reception desk doing something complicated, of Okafor watching with her arms at her sides, and an expression that was its own form of reassessment. Staff Sergeant Rachel Carter Voss, Briggs said, "You never stopped serving. We just stopped being the ones you were serving." Rachel looked at him. She did not cry. She had not cried during the night shift or the meetings or the statement to Kwok or any of the 36 hours that had preceded this moment, and she did not cry now. But something in her chest did a thing that was not nothing, a shift in some internal pressure that had been building for 4 years and 3 months, and however many days it had been since she'd walked away from the only identity she'd known for 8 years and tried to build a different one in a flat city with a buzzing fluorescent light and a med cart that was always in the wrong bay. "Thank you," she said. It was enough. Briggs understood that. He saluted her. She returned it, clean, precise, the movement of a body that had not forgotten. And the lobby held that for a moment, and then it released, and the people around them did what people in lobbies did, which was to keep living, which was what lobbies were for. The days after that were not clean. Rachel had known they wouldn't be, and she'd been right. The news cycle did what news cycles did. It found the story and ran with it in directions she hadn't anticipated, and some she had. And for approximately a week, she could not walk through the lobby of Hargrove Memorial without someone she'd never met looking at her with an expression she didn't have a comfortable response to. People she'd worked beside for 4 years came to her with the particular awkwardness of people who were recalibrating a relationship they thought they understood. Some of them were genuine. Some of them were performing. She treated both the same way, which was with the patient and slightly tired civility of a person who had agreed to be seen and was now dealing with the consequences of that agreement. Westbrook's arraignment was 12 days after his arrest. He was charged with criminal negligence resulting in death, 2 counts, corresponding to the 2 patients, as well as falsification of medical records, obstruction of a federal investigation, and conspiracy with Patricia Say. The hearing was public record, which meant the local paper covered it, which meant everyone at Hargrove Memorial read about it, which meant the staff who had watched him walk these halls for 9 years as though he owned them had to sit with the fact of what he'd actually been. Say was charged separately with unauthorized disclosure of classified federal records, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Her attorney released a statement indicating she intended to plead not guilty. Kwok's office released a counter-statement indicating that the phone forensics were unambiguous. Rachel did not follow this closely. She had given her documentation and her statement and her 12 months of careful records to people who would use them correctly, and following the procedural aftermath was not something she had the energy for, and not something that changed what had already happened. Holst resigned 14 days after the story broke. His resignation letter, which was released to the hospital board and leaked to the Courier-Herald within 48 hours, cited personal reasons and a desire to support the hospital's transition to new leadership. It did not acknowledge the investigation, the complaints he'd ignored, or the credential reinstatement he'd failed to prevent. Rachel read it once and put it down and did not pick it up again. What she cared about was the hospital's announcement, 3 weeks after everything, that an independent review board was being convened to examine patient care practices and administrative oversight going back 5 years. It was not a perfect solution. Review boards were not perfect solutions. They were slow and procedural, and their findings took months to translate into anything real. But they were real, and the commitment to convene one was real, and the names on the oversight committee included 2 physicians Rachel respected and 1 patient advocate whose work she had followed from a distance for years. She submitted written testimony to the review board within the week. Marcus was discharged on day 9. She was there when he left, not because she'd arranged to be, but because her shift happened to include that corridor at that time. And she told herself that was the reason, and it was not entirely a lie. He came out of the room under his own power, which she'd known he would. He was the kind of person who would have come out under his own power with cracked ribs and a fever if anyone had tried to wheel him. And he was thinner than he'd been in the trauma bay, which was what surgery and a cardiac event and 9 days of hospital food did to a person. He stopped when he saw her. "You're on shift," he said. "I'm always on shift," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that direct, unhurried assessment she'd come to recognize. "Price told me about the lobby," he said. "The recognition. Price talks a lot for an operator." "He respects you," Marcus said. "That's his version of it." She looked at him. The drain site covered by his shirt, the careful way he was distributing his weight, the eyes that were sharp again in the way they hadn't been in the first days when the sedation was still clearing. He was going to be fine. She had known that, but knowing it and seeing it were different, and seeing it was better. "Take your follow-up appointment seriously," she said. "I know you're going to want to go straight back into conditioning. Don't. The repair needs 6 weeks minimum before any load-bearing activity and 8 before anything else." "I know," he said. "Do you, though?" A brief pause. "Price will tell on me if I don't." "Price will tell on you anyway. I gave him my number specifically for that purpose." She had not, in fact, but she watched Marcus's face accept it as true and decided to let that stand. "Seriously, 8 weeks." "8 weeks," he said. He put out his hand and she shook it, and it was a firm handshake from someone who was still mending and put some of what he wanted to say into the grip because he was the kind of person who communicated that way. And she received it the same way. And that was enough. He left. The thing about days that followed large events was that they revealed what was actually true versus what the event had temporarily made feel true. In the immediate aftermath, things felt settled. The recognition, the arrests, the lobby, the formal record cleared. But Rachel had lived enough to know that the feeling of settled and the state of settled were not the same thing, and that the real work was always in the ordinary days that came after the extraordinary ones. So she worked. She worked the way she had always worked, which was completely and without ceremony, and with the specific care of someone who understood that most of the things that mattered happened in small moments rather than large ones. The elderly patient in Bay 7 who needed someone to sit with him, not because there was something medically wrong, but because he was frightened and alone. The resident who was making a decision Rachel could see was going to be wrong before it was made, whom she redirected with one question rather than a correction, because one question preserved the resident's authority while achieving the same outcome. The night nurse who had made the medication error on Marcus's watch and who was clearly carrying it, Rachel found her during a break 2 weeks later and said what needed to be said, which was not, "It wasn't your fault," which was too easy, but you caught it faster than most people would have when I flagged it, and that matters. And now you know something about that interaction that you will never miss again. The nurse looked at her. Is that how you think about your mistakes? She asked. Rachel considered the question honestly. I think about them as information, she said. The mistake already happened. The only thing I can control is what I know afterward. It was not a perfect philosophy. Nothing was a perfect philosophy. But it was the one she'd built across years of situations where the cost of a mistake was not a write-up, and it was not a performance review, and it was sometimes the thing you could not take back, and she had learned to carry that without letting it become something that paralyzed her. And she did not always succeed at that, but she kept trying. 3 weeks after the lobby, Hargrove Memorial's interim CEO, a woman named Dr. Simone Adler, brought in from a regional health network to stabilize the administration while the board searched for permanent leadership, called Rachel into her office. Not the same office Holst had used. She'd moved the administrative base to a different floor while Holst's office was reviewed as part of the records investigation, and the new temporary space was smaller and had fewer windows and felt, Rachel thought, more honest for it. Adler was direct. She had been direct in every interaction Rachel had observed with her in the 3 weeks since her arrival, which Rachel appreciated. I've reviewed the complete personnel file, Adler said, everything from the last 4 years, including the complaint that was filed and then withdrawn. It was withdrawn before the investigation, Rachel said. The circumstances, I know the circumstances, Adler said. I'm not raising it as a concern, I'm raising it as context. She looked at Rachel steadily. I want to offer you a formal role expansion. Trauma unit lead with supervisory authority over nursing protocols in the department. The position has been functionally yours and everything but title for, from what I can tell, several years. I'd like to make it official. Rachel looked at her. There are nurses with more seniority, she said. There are nurses with more time in this building, Adler said. That's not the same thing. She leaned forward slightly. I've spoken to Dr. Okafor, who is going to be the interim trauma chief. She specifically requested you in this role. The two of you have apparently worked together in practice already. We have. Then this formalizes what already exists, with the authority to go with it. Adler paused. You could also leave. I understand if that's what makes sense. What happened here, how you were treated, what was allowed to happen around you. I wouldn't blame you for deciding this isn't the place you want to continue. Rachel thought about that honestly. She thought about the fluorescent light that still buzzed in the trauma bay and the med cart that she had been putting back in the correct position for 4 years, and the 17-year-old in Bay 3 on the day this started, whose attending had written the order wrong. She thought about Priya, 6 weeks in and already watching and learning and becoming something, and the night nurse who now knew something about hepatic pathways that she would never miss again. She thought about Mrs. Alderton, whom she hadn't known but whose name she now knew, and the 63-year-old man, and the documentation that was now in federal hands and was going to mean something for cases that hadn't happened yet. She thought about what it meant to be somewhere, to choose a place not because it was comfortable, but because it was where the work was. I'll take the role, she said. Adler nodded once. Good. Rachel accepted the handshake and the paperwork and walked out of the office and took the stairs back down to the trauma floor, which was where she was needed, and went to work. The last time she saw Strick before he left Caldwell, he found her in the break room at the end of a shift. He had changed out of uniform, which meant he was about to travel, and he had coffee he'd apparently sourced from somewhere better than the hospital machine, which he handed to her without comment. She took it, drank it. It was in fact better. The investigation is going to take 6 months, minimum, he said. The criminal proceedings longer. I know. Kwok will be in contact throughout. You'll be called as a witness. I know, she said again. He was quiet for a moment. It was the quiet of a person who had several things to say and was selecting the right one. You built something here, he said finally. It doesn't look like what you built before, but it's not smaller. She looked at him. It's different, she said. Yes, he agreed. That's what I meant. He left. She finished the coffee and then finished her shift notes and then sat in the break room for 5 minutes by herself, which was the only time she was by herself all day, and she used it the way she used most quiet moments, which was to think clearly about what was true and what wasn't. What was true? A man who had been harming patients had been stopped. 2 deaths were being properly investigated, and the findings would be on record. A system that had protected him was being examined by people with the authority to make the findings mean something. The staff at this hospital were going to work in a department where the authority structure was no longer built to protect the person at the top of it at the expense of everyone below. What else was true? None of that undid what had already happened. The 2 deaths were permanent. The years of dismissed complaints were permanent. The specific kind of damage that came from being dismissed and overridden and told that your judgment didn't matter. That didn't simply reverse because the reversal had come. It left marks. She knew that from her own experience, and she knew it from watching the nurses around her who had worked under Westbrook's authority and absorbed the message it sent, which was that they were less than, which was a message that had to be actively unlearned even after the source of it was gone. That was going to be part of the work too, maybe the harder part. She thought about what Priya had asked her in the supply room. I want to be able to do that. You already do it, Rachel had said. And it was true. But it also took time. And it took having someone in the room who treated your judgment as worth listening to. And it took accumulating enough experiences where you'd been right and been heard being right that you started to trust yourself. And that trust was the thing Westbrook had been systematically dismantling every time he sent a nurse out of a bay or dismissed a flagged concern without examination or made it clear through the specific grammar of his authority that the people below him existed to execute his decisions rather than to think. Rachel was going to build that back. Not because she'd been formally recognized, not because her service record was now public, not because she had a title that matched her function. She was going to build it back because it was the work. And she had always been someone who did the work. She stood up from the table and put the coffee cup in the bin and straightened her scrubs and went back out into the hallway, which was lit and noisy and full of the specific organized motion of a trauma department doing what a trauma department was built to do. Priya was at the nurses' station when Rachel got there, working through a chart with the focused attention she'd been showing more and more consistently since the first week. She looked up when Rachel came in. Bay 2 is ready, she said, and the attending flagged something in Bay 4 I wanted to show you. The drainage output looks off, and I'm not sure if it's the measurement or the patient. Show me, Rachel said. They went together. That was how it started again, not with a ceremony or a statement or a moment that anyone watching would have identified as significant. Just 2 nurses walking into a bay to look at something that might be nothing and might be something, which was the work, which was always the work, which was the only thing Rachel had ever been any good at and the only thing she had ever truly needed to be. She had spent 4 years being invisible in this building. She had kept her head down and her records clean and her history locked in an encrypted folder and told herself that was the right choice, the sustainable choice, the choice that let her keep doing what she needed to do without the weight of what she'd been pressing down on everything she was trying to build. But here was the thing she understood now, on the other side of 36 hours that had torn all of it open. The weight had been there the whole time. She'd just been the only one carrying it. When you carry something alone long enough, you start to think the weight is part of you. You start to think the carrying is just how it feels to be alive. You stop being able to tell the difference between who you are and what you've been forced to hold. It was only when someone else finally saw it, really saw it, not the version you'd assembled for them, but the actual thing, that you understood how heavy it had been. She hadn't known she was waiting for that until it happened. She wasn't sure she'd have said she needed it, but she had, and now she knew what it felt like to put a weight down, not because it had defeated her, but because the right people were finally in the room and the ground was finally solid enough to set it on. She stepped into Bay 4. She looked at the chart. She looked at the patient. She looked at Priya, who was watching her with the particular attention of someone who was learning how to see. Good catch, Rachel said. It's the patient, not the measurement. Let's get the attending. Priya nodded and reached for the phone. Rachel stood at the bedside and checked the patient's vitals with her own hands, the way she always had, the way she always would. Because the data on the screen was not the same as the information in front of you, and the information in front of you was always the thing that mattered most. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. She didn't notice it anymore.